What would happen if the moon fractured above a silent desert? In this video, I'll break down how I created this surreal scene in Blender, from the procedural dunes to the fractured moon and the pulse that travels across the landscape. The interesting part is that none of these pieces are particularly complex on their own. The scene is made up of four main pieces: a procedural desert, a fractured moon, a traveling energy pulse, and some subtle compositing and impact frames. I'll break down each part step by step, and at the end of every section, I'll show the shader setups and node graphs used to create the effect. The video is also organized into chapters so you can easily jump to any part you're interested in. If you enjoy breakdowns like this, consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps small creators like me to continue working on projects like these. Let's start with the desert. The dunes start as a simple grid. Instead of sculpting terrain manually, I use procedural displacement so the dunes stay clean and easy to control. To create the dunes, I added a displace modifier to the grid and used a Voronoi texture to drive the displacement as shown here. After adjusting the scale and strength values, I arrived at the following setup, which creates these dune formations across the landscape. This procedural approach makes it easy to reshape the terrain later if needed. For the sand, I wanted a stylized look rather than something photorealistic. I started with the base shader that I've used in a few previous projects. It's a simple diffuse BSDF connected to a shader to RGB node, followed by a color ramp. This creates a basic gradient across the surface depending on how the light hits the dunes. Next, I wanted to introduce some directional patterns that resemble sand shaped by wind. To do that, I added a noise texture connected to a color ramp, and then increased the Y scale value in the mapping node. After adjusting the noise and color ramp values, we start to get these long directional patterns across the dunes. To add more variation, I layered in another texture. This time, a wave texture combined with a color ramp. After tweaking the values, a repeating pattern that adds an extra level of detail to the sand surface is created. Finally, these layers are mixed together with the original gradient to create the final desert shader. Later in the animation, these patterns are subtly animated by adjusting the location values in the mapping nodes, which helps give these dunes a sense of motion. Here is a final shader if you would like to pause the video and take a look. Next is a sky. For this scene, I reused a similar sky setup that I created in a previous video. I'll leave a link to that in the description if you'd like to explore it in more detail. The base sky is simply a gradient texture connected to a color ramp, adjusted to create a night desert atmosphere. The stars are generated using a Voronoi texture connected to another color ramp, which is then mixed into the gradient. Most of the scene is primarily lit by a sunlight source, which helps shape the dunes. This background setup also helps separate the moon from the sky and adds a subtle sense of depth into the scene. The moon begins as a simple sphere. For the surface detail, I used a simple shader with the moon texture plugged into an emission node, with an RGB curve used to color the color and the contrast. Here is a final shader setup if you'd like to pause the video and take a closer look. To fracture the moon, I use Blender's self-fracture tool. If you don't already have it enabled, you can add it from the extensions section in Blender's preferences. Once the moon was fractured, I used proportional editing to move the clusters of fragments slightly outward. This creates the effect of the moon slowly breaking apart rather than exploding. After adjusting the pieces, I selected the fragments and keyframed their new positions. keep the moon texture seamless, I then selected the remaining unfractured pieces and then merged them together. This ensures the texture continues smoothly across the surface. Once everything was in place, the fractured moon animation was ready. Next, I moved on to compositing to help give the scene a more stylized look. Lighting in the scene is intentionally minimal. Most of the environment is illuminated by the moon itself. Although the moon uses an emissive shader, the glow effect is actually created in the compositor. In the compositor, I added a glare node to create a subtle bloom around the moon. Before the scene was finished, I wanted the desert itself to react to the moon fracturing, and that reaction became the pulse traveling across the dunes. The most important animation in this scene is the pulse moving across the desert. To create this effect, I first duplicated the dune mesh, simplified it slightly, and placed it above the original terrain. This new mesh is where the pulse animation lives, driven entirely by a shader. The pulse is driven by a simple animated mask that travels across the terrain. The idea was that the desert reacts a moment after the moon fractures, creating a delayed response. To build the pulse shape, I used a map range node connected to a color ramp, which creates a narrow band across the surface. A mapping node controls both the direction and the movement of this band. This mask is then connected to a factor of a mix shader, blending between a principal BSDF and a transparent BSDF. The white parts of the mask become transparent, revealing the pulse as it travels across the dunes. But a perfectly clean band felt a little too artificial. So I added a noise texture before the map range node, which introduces variation and makes the pulse feel more organic. After tweaking the color ramp, I created two pulses that passes through the desert one after the other, adding more visual rhythm to the moment. Finally, I keyframe the pulse movement so it travels across the dunes shortly after the moon fracture begins. But the scene still felt a little too clean, so the next step was adding some stylized compositing to push the atmosphere further. Before moving fully into compositing, I made a small change to the sky. I removed the stars near the horizon using a gradient mask, which helps create a smoother transition between the desert and the night sky. This gradient is combined with the star texture in the world shader using a color dodge mix node to create the final sky setup. Here is a final shader setup if you'd like to pause the video and take a closer look. Next, I added a Kuwahara filter in the compositor. This filter is what gives the scene that slightly painterly, stylized look. It simplifies the color regions while preserving the edges, which works really well for this type of surreal environment. I also experimented with something a little bit more dramatic, an impact frame. Even a single exaggerated frame can make an event feel much stronger. It's a technique often used in animation to emphasize key moments. To create this effect, I converted the render to black and white in the compositor using the node setup shown here. A color ramp set to constant interpolation creates this sharp, graphic look. This version is then mixed with the original render using a mix node, allowing me to quickly switch between normal frame and the impact frame. I also wanted two impact frames to appear one after the other, so I used an invert node to alternate between the two visuals. But the frames still need a little bit more direction. So I added a few triangular shapes and then animated their position to match the moment of the impact. This helps reinforce the motion of the fracture while keeping the overall look stylized. But the desert still needed something to establish scale, and that's where the monolith comes in. The monolith itself is intentionally simple, just dark rectangular form placed in the landscape. Its purpose is mainly symbolic. It gives the viewer a reference point that helps communicate how massive the moon really is. And to subtly tie in the event happening above, I split the monolith and animated it alongside the moon fracture. It's a small detail, but it helps to connect the different elements in the scene. To enhance depth in the scene, I added a subtle volume fog layer. This softens the horizon slightly and separates the foreground dunes from the background sky. In the end, this project was mainly an experiment in atmosphere and scale, seeing how far a simple idea could go using procedural techniques and subtle animation. And sometimes, combining a handful of simple ideas can create a momentum that feels much larger. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.